October 18th, 1081, the marshes outside Dyrrhachium. 1,000 English warriors stood in the Byzantine battle line, their massive Danish axes resting on shoulders that carried 15 years of rage. They had fled their homeland after the Norman conquest, watched their country burn, seen their families dispossessed, their king killed at Hastings. Now, in the service of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, they faced Normans again. Different Normans, led by Robert Guiscard, Duke of Apulia, but Normans nonetheless. Men who spoke the same language, wore the same armour, and fought with the same brutal efficiency as those who had destroyed England. The Varangian Guard, as they were now called, had requested the honour of forming the vanguard. They wanted first blood. They were about to get it. What they didn't know was that in less than 2 hours, most of them would be dead, burned alive in a church after making one of the most catastrophic tactical mistakes in medieval warfare. This is the story of how Norman knights charged the Varangian Guard and were driven back in terror, only to return minutes later and annihilate them to the last man. It's a story about revenge, tactical brilliance, and how a single moment of bloodlust can destroy an elite military force. The Varangian Guard was one of the most formidable military units of the medieval world. Originally composed of Scandinavian warriors from Kiev and Rus, they had served as the personal bodyguards of Byzantine emperors since 989, when Emperor Basil II recruited 6,000 Vikings to help crush a rebellion. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were professional warriors, many of them exiles and adventurers seeking fame and fortune in the fabled city of Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, the Great City. The pay was exceptional, the prestige enormous, and the combat reputation unmatched. They fought with weapons that terrified everyone who faced them. The Danish long axe, a two-handed weapon with a blade measuring 20 to 30 centimetres wide, mounted on a shaft that could reach 2 metres in length. These axes could cleave through armour, sever limbs and decapitate horses with a single swing. Byzantine historian John Kinnamos called them axe-bearers, and the fear they inspired was substantial. At the Battle of Cannae in 1018, not the famous Carthaginian victory but a Byzantine triumph over Lombard rebels in southern Italy, the Varangians had played a decisive role, their axes cutting through enemy formations with terrifying efficiency. In 1038, during the attempted reconquest of Sicily, they fought alongside Norman mercenaries who had recently arrived in Italy, seeking adventure and profit. Among their ranks at that time was Harold Sigurdsson, known to history as Harold Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway and die at Stamford Bridge just 3 weeks before the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But everything changed in 1066. When William the Conqueror defeated King Harold Godwinson at Hastings, England fell under Norman control. The Anglo-Saxon nobility faced a choice: submit to foreign rule, lose their lands and status, or leave. Thousands chose exile. Some went to Scotland, some to Ireland, but the most ambitious made the long journey to Constantinople, where they knew the Byzantine Empire employed foreign warriors in its famous Varangian Guard. The first wave arrived around 1074, in time to help Emperor Michael Ducas repel a barbarian siege. By 1080, Byzantine records explicitly mention Angli, English warriors, as forming part of the Guard. More arrived in 1088, over 5,000 men arriving in 235 ships according to one source, settling along the Black Sea coast or entering imperial service. The influx of English warriors changed the character of the Varangian Guard. While they maintained the traditional Danish long axes, many English preferred the double-edged battle axe they had used at Hastings. The weapons were similar enough that the Guard's fearsome reputation remained intact, but now it was fueled by something beyond professional pride. The English Varangians carried a burning hatred for Normans that made them exceptionally motivated. They had lost everything to Norman conquest. In the service of Byzantium they found not just employment but purpose. If they couldn't fight Normans in England, they would fight them wherever they found them. In 1081, opportunity arrived. Robert Guiscard, one of the most successful Norman adventurers in history, decided to invade the Byzantine Empire. Guiscard, whose nickname meant the cunning or the resourceful, had already conquered Byzantine southern Italy, taking Bari, the last Byzantine city in Italy, in 1071. He had carved out a Norman kingdom in Apulia and Calabria, and now he turned his ambitions eastward toward the Balkans. His excuse was flimsy but provided political cover. The former Byzantine Emperor Michael VII had betrothed his son to Guiscard's daughter years earlier. When Michael was deposed by Nikephoros III in 1078, and then Nikephoros himself was overthrown by Alexios Komnenos in 1081, Guiscard claimed he was invading to restore Michael's rights. He even brought along a man claiming to be the deposed emperor, though nobody believed the impostor's identity. The real reason was simpler. Guiscard saw weakness and opportunity. The Byzantine Empire was reeling from the catastrophic defeat at Manzikert in 1071, where the Seljuk Turks had destroyed the Byzantine army and captured the emperor. Most of Anatolia, the empire's heartland, had been lost. The military structure was shattered. Alexios Komnenos had seized the throne through a coup just months earlier, and was desperately trying to hold together an empire that seemed to be collapsing. Guiscard believed he could carve out a Norman principality in the Balkans, perhaps even threaten Constantinople itself. In May 1081, Guiscard's fleet of 150 ships, including 60 horse transports, departed from southern Italy. His army numbered approximately 15,000 men, though his daughter Anna Komnena, who later wrote a detailed history called the Alexiad, inflated the number to 30,000. The core of his force was 1,300 Norman knights. The heavy cavalry that had proven decisive at Hastings and in countless battles across southern Italy and Sicily. Supporting them were thousands of infantry, including spearmen, archers and crossbowmen, along with lighter cavalry for scouting and skirmishing. The fleet was hit by a storm crossing the Adriatic, losing several ships, but Guiscard was not easily discouraged. He regrouped at Avalona in Byzantine territory, was joined by ships from Ragusa, a Balkan republic hostile to the Byzantines, and then sailed north to capture the island of Corfu, which surrendered due to its small garrison. With a secure base and clear supply lines to Italy, he marched to Dyrrhachium, the capital and chief port of the Byzantine province of Illyria. Dyrrhachium, modern Durrës in Albania, was one of the most important Byzantine cities in the west. Built on a long, narrow peninsula jutting into the Adriatic, it was naturally defensible and well fortified. When Guiscard's army arrived on June 17, 1081, the city was under the command of George Palaiologos, a capable Byzantine general who had prepared the defences meticulously. He positioned catapults at key points, maintained constant vigilance, and in the early days of the siege conducted a daring night raid using naphtha and pitch to set fire to a massive Norman siege tower. The garrison fought ferociously, using boiling substances, projectiles, and everything at their disposal to repel Norman assaults. Palaiologos himself was wounded by an arrow to the head, but continued directing the defence. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexios moved quickly to organise relief. He needed allies, especially naval power to counter the Norman fleet. He turned to Venice, offering extensive trading rights in exchange for military assistance. The Doge of Venice, Domenico Selvo, recognised that Norman control of the Strait of Otranto threatened Venetian commercial interests, so he personally took command of the Venetian fleet and sailed immediately. The Venetians caught the Norman fleet, commanded by Guiscard's son Bohemond, by surprise at dusk. Despite tenacious resistance, the Normans lacked experience in naval combat. The Venetian ships attacked in a close formation and used Greek firebombs, incendiary weapons that burned even on water. The Norman line scattered, and the Venetian fleet sailed into Dyrrhachium's harbour, breaking the blockade and delivering supplies to the besieged garrison. By September, Alexios had assembled an army. The exact size is debated, with estimates ranging from 18,000 to 25,000 men. It was a heterogeneous force that reflected the empire's desperate situation. The corps consisted of about 5,000 tagmatic cavalry from Macedonia and Thrace, professional soldiers from the central field armies. There were elite guard units, the excubita and vestiaritai, numbering around 1,000 men. The Varangian Guard contributed approximately 1,400 warriors, mostly English now, along with some Scandinavians and Danish. Beyond these regular troops, Alexios had recruited widely. There were 2,800 Manichaeans from Bulgaria, heretics from the hill tribes who served as infantry. Armenian infantry provided additional foot soldiers. Most problematically, there were 7,000 Turkish auxiliaries sent by the Seljuk Sultan, traditional enemies who were allied with Byzantium for reasons of political expediency, along with 2,000 more Turkish horse archers and 1,000 Frankish mercenaries. Serbian forces under King Constantine Bodin had also agreed to join, bringing several thousand more men. It was an army assembled through bribes, diplomacy and desperation, lacking the cohesion and training of the forces that had made Byzantium great. Alexios organised his army into 3 divisions, a standard Byzantine formation. He personally commanded the centre, where the Varangian Guard was positioned as a vanguard, backed by archers. The left wing, considered the stronger force, was commanded by Gregory Pacurianos. The right wing was under Nikephoros Melisinus, though his loyalty was questionable since he had rival claims to the throne. Guiscard learned through spies that the Byzantine army was approaching. He moved his army away from the siege lines to meet them in open battle. The Norman commander was a master of tactical warfare, and he arrayed his forces carefully. He personally commanded the centre. His son Bohemond, already showing the military genius that would make him one of the great leaders of the First Crusade, commanded the left wing. Count Amicetus of Giovinazzo commanded the right. Guiscard's plan was simple but effective. His heavy cavalry, the Norman knights who had conquered England and southern Italy, would be held in reserve while his infantry and lighter forces absorbed the initial Byzantine attack. When the moment was right, the knights would deliver the decisive blow. On the night of October 17th, Alexios planned a surprise attack on the Norman camp. He intended to send Serbian and Turkish forces through the marshes to hit Guiscard's rear while launching a frontal assault. It was a good plan, but Guiscard anticipated it. Through his intelligence network, he learned of the Byzantine approach and quietly moved his army during the night to the opposite side of the lagoon, leaving his camp empty. When the Byzantine forces arrived to attack, they found nothing. The element of surprise was lost. On the morning of October 18th, both armies formed for battle. The Varangian Guard took their position at the front of the Byzantine centre, their axes gleaming in the morning sun. Behind them, archers prepared to provide covering fire. These were not the longbowmen of later centuries, but composite bow users who could deliver volleys at medium range. Alexios ordered an advance. The Varangians led, moving forward in formation. Byzantine archers employed a tactic they had practiced, moving in front of the Varangians, loosing a volley of arrows, then retreating behind the protection of the heavily armoured axemen. This pattern repeated as the army advanced cautiously toward the Norman lines, everyone aware that Norman cavalry could charge at any moment. Guiscard sent forward a detachment of cavalry from his centre to probe the Byzantine position. It was a feint, designed to draw out the Varangians into premature commitment. The ruse failed. The approaching cavalry was driven back by concentrated archery. The Varangians held their position, maintaining discipline. Then the Norman right wing, commanded by Count Amicetus, suddenly charged forward, directing their attack at the junction between the Byzantine left and centre, specifically targeting the Varangian left flank. The thundering approach of heavy cavalry, armoured men on armoured horses carrying lances couched under their arms, was one of the most terrifying sights in medieval warfare. The impact of such a charge could shatter infantry formations through sheer momentum. But the Varangians held. These were men who had faced Norman cavalry before, at Hastings and in countless skirmishes across England. They knew that heavy cavalry's power came from movement, and that stationary, determined infantry with long weapons could stop them. The Varangians stood firm, their axes ready. As the Norman cavalry crashed into them, the axemen swung their massive weapons with devastating effect. Horses were crippled, riders dismounted, and the charge stalled in the face of determined resistance. At the same moment, the Byzantine left wing, including some of Alexios's elite troops, launched their own attack against Amicetus's cavalry. The combined pressure was too much. The Norman right wing broke. Cavalry wheeled and fled toward the coast, discipline dissolving into panic. The carefully organised formation shattered, and Norman knights who had seemed invincible moments before were now running for their lives. The Varangians saw their hated enemies fleeing. These were Normans, the same kind of men who had conquered England, killed King Harold, dispossessed their families and forced them into exile. For 15 years they had dreamed of this moment. Revenge was within reach. The Varangians charged in pursuit. Their commander, a man named Nabitz, either ordered the pursuit or was unable to stop his men. Every instinct of vengeance drove them forward. They broke formation, streaming after the fleeing Normans, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. Anna Komnena, describing this moment in her history, noted the Varangians' ferocity. They had requested the vanguard specifically so they could be first to engage the Normans. Now they were cutting down fleeing enemies, their axes rising and falling, Norman blood soaking into the Albanian soil. But They had forgotten one of the most fundamental principles of Byzantine military doctrine: never pursue fleeing troops, never break formation in the pursuit, never separate from the main force. The rule existed because pursuit made troops vulnerable. Scattered, exhausted, out of formation, they became easy targets for a counterattack. The Varangians, blinded by rage and the intoxication of victory, ignored these principles. They chased the Norman right wing all the way to the shoreline, cutting down stragglers, convinced they were winning the battle. Robert Guiscard watched from his position in the Norman centre. His right wing had broken and fled, a serious blow. But he was a veteran commander who had fought dozens of battles across 3 decades. He recognised the opportunity immediately. The Varangians were now completely separated from the Byzantine main force, nearly half a mile away from their supporting units. They were exhausted from their charge and their fighting. They were disordered, their formation broken, men scattered in small groups. They were perfect targets. Guiscard gave the orders. From his centre he sent forward a strong mixed force. Spearmen and disciplined infantry who could stand against even the fearsome Varangian axes in close combat. Crossbowmen whose powerful bolts could penetrate the heavy armour the Varangians wore. These forces moved quickly around the Varangian right flank, positioning themselves to attack from the side and rear. At the same time, Bohemond's cavalry on the Norman left, which had been waiting for orders, began to organise a countercharge. The Norman right wing, which had fled to the coast, was being rallied by Guiscard's wife Sichelgaita. According to legend, she rode among the fleeing knights in full armour, brandishing a spear, shaming them into reforming. Whether this story is entirely accurate or propaganda, the Norman right did reform and prepare to return to battle. The Varangians realised too late what was happening. They saw Norman infantry approaching their flank. They saw cavalry massing. They tried to form up to create a defensive line, but they were spread out over hundreds of yards of coastline. Exhaustion from the charge and combat made coordinated movement difficult. Communication in the chaos was nearly impossible. The Norman attack was devastating. Crossbowmen opened fire first, their bolts slamming into Varangian ranks from medium range. Unlike arrows, crossbow bolts had enormous penetrating power, capable of punching through mail armour and even some plate. Men fell, wounded or killed before they could close to axe range. Then the spearmen hit them. Professional Norman infantry, fighting in formation with long spears, could match even the Varangians at close quarters. The key was that the Varangians were disorganised and the Normans were not. In small groups, even elite warriors can be overwhelmed by superior numbers and organisation. Norman cavalry, led by Bohemond, charged into the Varangians from another direction. Mounted warriors smashing into disordered infantry created carnage. The Varangians tried to fight back. Their axes rose and fell, and Normans died under the massive blades, but they were surrounded, outnumbered, and exhausted. Men who had been celebrating victory minutes before now fought desperately for survival. The Byzantine historian Geoffrey Malaterra, a Norman monk who chronicled Robert Guiscard's campaigns, described the scene. The Varangians, he said, had started the battle by making a fierce attack in 2 columns, and initially the situation was very unfavourable to the Normans. But then one of the Norman squadrons attacked them on their unprotected flanks, and this gallant attack forced them, wounded and terrified by the assault, to flee toward the church. The Church of the Archangel Michael stood nearby, a stone building that offered potential sanctuary. Medieval warfare had complex rules about religious sanctuary, and churches were theoretically protected spaces. The surviving Varangians, their numbers decimated, their commander possibly dead or captured, broke and ran for the church. They reached it and barricaded themselves inside, hoping for mercy or at least a chance to negotiate surrender. The Normans had no intention of granting either. These were the same warriors who had fought so ferociously against them, who had nearly driven their right wing from the field, who had killed hundreds of Norman soldiers. More importantly, Robert Guiscard needed to send a message. He needed to destroy Byzantine morale completely. Allowing the Varangians to surrender would suggest they had fought honourably and earned respect. Guiscard wanted terror. Norman soldiers surrounded the church. They piled wood against the walls and doors. They set fire to the building. Inside, the Varangians realised what was happening. They were trapped. The doors were barred from outside. Windows were too small or too high to escape through. The fire spread rapidly, consuming the wooden roof and everything flammable inside. Smoke filled the interior. Heat became unbearable. According to all historical accounts, every Varangian inside the church died. They were burned alive, unable to escape, their screams audible across the battlefield. Some sources suggest a few might have escaped, including possibly their commander Nebites, but the vast majority perished in the flames. The destruction of the Varangian Guard took perhaps 20 minutes from the moment the Norman counterattack began to the final deaths in the burning church. The Byzantine centre watched in horror. Their best troops, their elite guard, the fierce axemen who were supposed to be invincible, had been annihilated. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Meanwhile, other parts of the battle were developing. The Byzantine left wing, which had initially driven back the Norman right, found itself isolated. Their allies on the left, Serbian forces under King Constantine Bodan, had been watching the battle from a distance, waiting to see which side would win before committing. When they saw the Varangians destroyed and the Byzantine centre in shock, Bodan made his decision. He retreated with his entire force, abandoning the Byzantines. The Turkish auxiliaries followed his example, unwilling to fight for a losing side. The Byzantine army was now missing its left wing, which was still pursuing remnants of the Norman right far from the main battle. Its centre guard had been destroyed, and its allies had deserted. Robert Guiscard recognised that the moment for decisive action had arrived. He had held his heavy cavalry in reserve throughout the opening phases of the battle, using them sparingly while infantry and lighter forces absorbed Byzantine attacks. Now he committed them fully. The Norman knights, perhaps the finest heavy cavalry in the world at that moment, formed up for a charge against the Byzantine centre. What followed was one of the most devastating cavalry charges in medieval history. Historian Robert Holmes later described it as marking a turning point in warfare, stating that the new knightly tactic of charging with the lance couched, tucked firmly under the arm to unite the impact of man and horse, proved a battle winner. The Norman cavalry charged in multiple echelons. The first wave hit Byzantine skirmishers, light troops who had no chance against armoured knights. They were scattered or trampled. The second wave broke into smaller detachments and smashed into various points along the Byzantine line, seeking weak spots, exploiting gaps. The Byzantine infantry, already demoralised by watching the Varangians burn, broke almost immediately. Units that might have held under other circumstances simply dissolved. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Emperor Alexios Komnenos tried desperately to rally his troops. He and his personal guard, the elite excubita and vestiaritai, fought with courage, but they could not stop the collapse. The Byzantine line shattered. The imperial camp, which had been left unguarded when the army advanced, fell to Norman soldiers who plundered it for supplies and treasures. Alexios himself barely escaped. Anna Komnena, his daughter, wrote emotionally about how her father resisted as long as possible before being forced to retreat, wounded by a Norman lance that struck his forehead and another that caught his leg. Count Amesitas personally pursued the emperor, and according to Anna, only divine intervention saved him. George Palaiologos, commanding the Dyrrhachium garrison, attempted to sortie from the city to help, but his forces were too few and too late to affect the outcome. He was forced to withdraw back into the city without accomplishing anything. The casualties were horrific for the Byzantines. Historian Jonathan Harris later wrote that the defeat was every bit as severe as that at Manzikert. Alexios lost approximately 5,000 men killed, with thousands more wounded or captured. The Varangian Guard was effectively destroyed. Most of the elite infantry, the cream of the Byzantine army, was dead. Norman casualties are less clear, but John Holden notes they were substantial, particularly among the infantry and the right wing that had initially broken and fled. However, the Normans held the field, controlled the battlefield, and could claim total victory. More importantly, they had psychologically shattered Byzantine morale. In the days after the battle, the situation deteriorated further for the Byzantines. Dyrrhachium, which had held out for months under siege, could no longer expect relief. The garrison fought on, but their situation was hopeless. In February 1082, after 4 more months of siege, the city fell when Italian residents, possibly Venetians or Amalfitans, opened the gates to the Normans from inside. With Dyrrhachium captured, the Normans advanced inland, taking most of northern Greece with minimal resistance. Cities surrendered rather than face Norman assault. The Byzantine position in the Balkans seemed on the verge of complete collapse. But Robert Guiscard could not exploit his victory fully. While he was in the Balkans, events in Italy demanded his attention. Pope Gregory VII, the Normans' nominal overlord, was besieged in Rome by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Guiscard was obligated to come to the Pope's aid. Additionally, Alexios's diplomats had been working behind the scenes, bribing German nobles and stirring up rebellion in Norman-controlled southern Italy. Guiscard was forced to return to Italy with most of his army in 1083, leaving his son Bohemond to continue the campaign with reduced forces. Bohemond won several more victories against Byzantine armies. At Ioannina, the capital of Epirus, he used his cavalry to devastating effect, flanking and routing Byzantine forces. At another battle near Arta, he again outflanked Alexios with his knights, crushing the Byzantine army. The Romans were fully demoralized from several defeats, and withdrew almost immediately once flanked. But Bohemond lacked the resources to hold his conquest permanently. Alexios, demonstrating the strategic brilliance that would define his 37-year reign, engaged in a war of attrition. He avoided major battles, harassed Norman supply lines, encouraged local resistance, and gradually wore down the occupying forces. By 1085, with Guiscard dead and Norman attention divided between Italy and the Balkans, the Byzantines had recovered most of their lost territory. Venice reoccupied Dyrrhachium on behalf of the empire and was rewarded with extensive trading privileges. But the Battle of Dyrrhachium remained a watershed moment. The Varangian Guard had been destroyed. Some sources indicate that a few survivors remained, and the unit would be reconstituted with new recruits, but it never again achieved its former prominence or prestige. The English warriors who had sought revenge against the Normans had instead found annihilation. Their pursuit of fleeing enemies, driven by hatred and the desire for vengeance, led directly to their destruction. They had broken the fundamental rule of medieval warfare: never break formation, never pursue beyond your supporting distance, never let emotion override tactical discipline. The Varangians paid for that mistake with their lives. The battle also demonstrated the effectiveness of Norman cavalry tactics. The charge of heavy cavalry with couched lances, acting in coordinated waves against a prepared enemy, proved devastating when properly executed. This was not a new tactic. Heavy cavalry had been used for centuries, but the Normans had refined it to a degree that made them nearly unstoppable on favourable terrain. The combination of armoured knights, well-trained infantry, and tactical flexibility made Norman armies formidable opponents. For the Byzantines, Dyrrhachium was another disaster in a decade of disasters. Manzikert in 1071 had lost them Anatolia and their military heartland. Bari in 1071 had ended their presence in Italy. Now Dyrrhachium in 1081 had cost them their elite guard, and nearly lost them the Balkans. Alexios Komnenos spent the next several years rebuilding Byzantine military power through a combination of diplomacy, alliances, military reforms, and sheer determination. He would eventually stabilize the empire and even begin recovering some lost territories, but the Battle of Dyrrhachium represented his lowest point. The memory of the Varangians burning in the church haunted Byzantine military thinking for years afterward. Future commanders emphasized the importance of maintaining formation and coordination, using the disaster as a cautionary tale. The English warriors of the Varangian Guard had sought to avenge their conquered homeland. They had faced Normans in battle and initially driven them back. For a few glorious minutes they had tasted victory and revenge. Then tactical overreach, the breaking of formation, and the ruthless efficiency of Norman combined arms warfare had destroyed them utterly. Robert Guiscard would die 4 years later in 1085, while campaigning against the Byzantines again. His son Bohemond would go on to become one of the great leaders of the First Crusade, capturing Antioch and establishing a Crusader principality in Syria. The Normans who fought at Dyrrhachium spread across the medieval world, their reputation for military effectiveness enhanced by their victory over the supposedly invincible Varangian Guard. Alexios Komnenos would rule until 1118, gradually restoring Byzantine power and prestige. His daughter Anna Komnena would write the Alexiad, one of the most important historical sources for the period, describing her father's achievements but also honestly recording his defeats. The Battle of Dyrrhachium occupies a significant portion of her narrative, and her description of the Varangians' fate carries obvious emotional weight. She portrays them as brave but undisciplined, fierce warriors who let passion override tactical sense. The battle entered military history as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuit, the importance of maintaining formation, and the decisive power of well-handled heavy cavalry. Medieval military theorists studied it, noting how Guiscard's tactics of feigned retreat followed by coordinated counterattack had devastated an opponent. The fact that the Varangians had initially succeeded in driving back Norman cavalry made their subsequent destruction even more instructive. Victory could turn to defeat in moments if discipline was lost. The English warriors who died at Dyrrhachium never saw their homeland again. They had travelled thousands of miles to serve in the Byzantine army, hoping to find purpose and perhaps revenge against the people who had conquered England. In their final moments, trapped in a burning church on the Albanian coast, they must have reflected on the path that brought them there. 15 years of exile, service in a foreign land, the hope of striking back at Normans, and then the catastrophic mistake of breaking formation in pursuit. Modern historians debate various aspects of the battle, the exact numbers involved, the precise sequence of events, and the specific reasons why the Varangians pursued so recklessly. Some argue that Nabates lost control of his men in the heat of battle. Others suggest that the pursuit was initially ordered as a tactical decision to maximise damage to the fleeing Norman right, but then could not be recalled when the situation changed. Still others propose that the Varangians' hatred of Normans was so intense that no amount of training or discipline could have restrained them once their enemies began fleeing. What remains clear is the tactical sequence. The Varangians held against a Norman cavalry charge, one of the most difficult feats in medieval warfare. They helped drive back the Norman right wing, achieving significant success. Then they pursued beyond supporting distance, broke formation, and became vulnerable to counterattack. When Norman forces surrounded and destroyed them, the psychological shock shattered Byzantine morale and contributed to the complete collapse of their army. The burning of the church, while consistent with the brutal standards of medieval warfare, was particularly shocking even by those standards. Churches were generally respected as sanctuaries, and massacre within a religious building violated contemporary norms. Robert Guiscard's decision to burn the Varangians alive rather than accept their surrender, or grant them the opportunity to die fighting, demonstrated both his ruthlessness and his understanding of psychological warfare. The sight of the church burning, with trapped men screaming inside, would have been visible across the battlefield, devastating morale among Byzantine troops who had considered the Varangians their strongest warriors. The battle also represented a clash, today, between different military cultures. The Varangians fought in a tradition derived from Viking warfare, emphasizing individual prowess, powerful weapons and aggressive tactics. Their axes were weapons of terror, capable of inflicting horrific wounds, but they required getting close to the enemy. The Normans fought in a more systematic way, combining heavy cavalry shock with disciplined infantry and effective use of missile troops like crossbowmen. Their tactics emphasized coordination, reserves, and flexibility. When these two systems clashed, Norman tactical sophistication won despite the Varangians' individual ferocity. The English warriors in the Varangian Guard had been elite troops in England before Hastings. Many had likely served as huscarls, the household troops of Anglo-Saxon nobles, who carried similar weapons and wore similar armour. They had seen Norman cavalry tactics work at Hastings, where repeated charges and feigned retreats had eventually broken the Saxon shield wall. They should have known better than to pursue fleeing cavalry. But knowing intellectually what can happen, and maintaining discipline in the heat of battle when your hated enemies are running, are two different things. The Varangians at Dyrrhachium made the same mistake that the English had made at Hastings, pursuing fleeing Normans and paying for it with their lives. In medieval military literature, the Battle of Dyrrhachium became a standard example alongside Hastings and other major Norman victories. Together, these battles demonstrated that the Norman military system, combining heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, missile troops, and tactical flexibility under experienced commanders, was the most effective military force of the late 11th century. The Normans' ability to absorb initial defeats, maintain reserve forces, and deliver decisive counterattacks made them exceptionally dangerous opponents. Their victories in England, southern Italy, Sicily, and against the Byzantines established Norman military dominance across much of Europe and the Mediterranean. The fate of the Varangian Guard at Dyrrhachium stands as one of the most dramatic examples of how elite troops can be destroyed through tactical mistakes. They were not defeated by superior enemies in straight combat. They held their ground against the initial Norman cavalry charge and helped drive part of the Norman army from the field. They were destroyed because they broke formation, pursued recklessly, and became vulnerable to a coordinated counterattack that their discipline and training should have taught them to avoid. The burning church became a symbol of how quickly success could transform into disaster in medieval warfare. Robert Guiscard's reputation as one of the great military commanders of the medieval period was solidified by his victory at Dyrrhachium. He had faced an army comparable in size to his own, commanded by a capable emperor, including elite troops with fearsome reputations. Through careful positioning, tactical flexibility, and ruthless exploitation of enemy mistakes, he had achieved complete victory. The fact that he could not fully exploit his success due to political complications in Italy does not diminish the tactical brilliance of the battle itself. Alexios Komnenos learned from his defeat. His subsequent campaigns showed greater caution, better coordination, and avoidance of decisive battles when circumstances were unfavourable. He developed a military system based on smaller, more flexible forces, extensive use of foreign mercenaries from various sources to avoid over-reliance on any single group, and diplomatic manoeuvring to complement military action. This approach, informed by disasters like Dyrrhachium, allowed him to gradually restore Byzantine power and establish the Komnenian dynasty as one of the more successful in Byzantine history. The English warriors who died at Dyrrhachium left few individual records. We don't know most of their names, where exactly in England they came from, or what specific experiences drove them to travel to Constantinople. We know they were there, that they formed a significant part of the Varangian Guard, and that they died fighting Normans on an Albanian battlefield. Their story is one of exile, service in foreign lands, the hope of revenge, and ultimately tragic defeat. They had sought to strike back at the people who destroyed their homeland. Instead, they ended up as a footnote in Byzantine military disasters, a cautionary tale about the dangers of undisciplined pursuit and tactical overreach. The Battle of Dyrrhachium on October 18, 1081 lasted only a few hours, but its consequences rippled through decades. It destroyed the Varangian Guard as an effective military force. It nearly cost the Byzantine Empire its Balkan provinces. It established Norman military dominance in yet another theatre, and it provided medieval commanders with a clear example of how tactical mistakes could negate superior troops and initial success. When Norman knights charged the Varangian Guard that October morning, they were driven back in shock and fear by axe-wielding warriors who had held firm. When those same warriors broke formation and pursued, they were surrounded and cut down in minutes, then burned alive in a church as the Norman army looked on. The transformation from triumph to disaster took less than an hour. That's how quickly fortunes could reverse in medieval warfare, when discipline failed and emotion overrode tactical sense. The destruction of the Varangian Guard at Dyrrhachium sent shockwaves far beyond the immediate battlefield. In Constantinople, when news arrived of the disaster, the imperial court reeled. The Varangians had been more than just another military unit. They were the physical embodiment of imperial prestige, the elite warriors who stood guard at the palace gates, who accompanied the emperor in public ceremonies, who represented Byzantine military might to foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries. Their annihilation suggested that the empire itself was vulnerable, mortal, capable of being defeated by mere mortals wielding lances and swords. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Each Varangian represented a substantial investment in training, equipment, and pay. The Guard received wages far exceeding normal soldiers, plus bonuses, spoils from campaigns, and various privileges. Losing over 1,000 of them in a single afternoon meant losing not just warriors, but a fortune in imperial treasury expenditure. Moreover, recruitment would now be problematic. The Varangian Guard's attraction had always been its reputation for invincibility and its record of survival. Men joined knowing they would face danger, but also believing they would likely survive to enjoy their substantial wages. After Dyrrhachium, that assumption was shattered. Why travel thousands of miles to Constantinople to join a guard unit that could be annihilated in minutes? The military implications extended beyond mere numbers. Byzantine tactical doctrine for decades had relied on using the Varangians as a heavy infantry anchor around which more flexible forces could maneuver. Cavalry would charge, retreat, and skirmish. Light infantry would harass and probe. Archers would provide covering fire, but the Varangians would hold the critical point, the place where the enemy must not pass, the position that could not be broken. Losing that anchor meant Byzantine commanders had to completely rethink their battle plans. Alexios spent months after Dyrrhachium developing new tactical formations that relied more heavily on cavalry and less on heavy infantry. He increased recruitment of Turkish horse archers, expanded the tagmatic cavalry units, and emphasized mobility over holding fixed positions. The Battle of Dyrrhachium forced a fundamental transformation in Byzantine military thinking. The psychological dimensions were perhaps even more significant than the tactical ones. Medieval warfare operated as much on reputation and intimidation as on actual combat capability. A unit known to be fearsome could win battles simply through its presence, as enemies would refuse to face it or would fight half-heartedly, already convinced of their inevitable defeat. The Varangians had enjoyed exactly this kind of reputation for nearly a century. Byzantine enemies from the Balkans to the Caucasus knew about the axe-bearing warriors from the north who never retreated and never surrendered. That reputation died in the flames of the Church of the Archangel Michael. After Dyrrhachium, enemies no longer feared the Varangians as invincible. The reconstituted guard that emerged in subsequent years never achieved the same psychological impact. In England, among the Anglo-Saxon diaspora scattered across Scotland, Ireland and Scandinavia, news of Dyrrhachium arrived months later through merchant networks and travelling clergy. The response was complex. Some saw it as proof that God had abandoned the English cause, that fighting against the Normans was futile and doomed. Others interpreted it as a tragic but honourable end for warriors who had refused to submit to foreign conquest. Songs and poems were composed, though few survive, commemorating the English warriors who died fighting their people's enemies far from home. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the historical record maintained by English monks, makes no mention of Dyrrhachium, perhaps because the chroniclers knew nothing of events so far away, or perhaps because acknowledging the destruction of English warriors in Byzantine service was too painful. Among the Normans, the battle became a source of immense pride and propaganda value. Robert Guiscard commissioned chronicles celebrating his victory. Geoffrey Malaterra, writing in Latin for a Norman audience, portrayed the battle as proof of divine favour and Norman military superiority. The story of the Varangians being burned in the church was told and retold, sometimes with embellishments. Some versions claimed the Varangians had sought sanctuary, but refused to surrender even when offered terms, choosing death over submission. Other versions suggested they had continued fighting from inside the church, shooting arrows and throwing spears through windows until the Normans had no choice but to burn them out. The truth was probably simpler and more brutal. The Normans wanted them dead, surrounded the church, and set it ablaze. Medieval warfare rarely featured the chivalric mercy that later romanticised accounts suggested. Bohemond, who would later lead the successful siege of Antioch during the First Crusade, learned crucial lessons at Dyrrhachium about the importance of reserves, the value of coordinated counterattacks, and the vulnerability of pursuing enemies. His tactics in Syria and Palestine showed clear influence from his father's victory in Albania. At Antioch in 1098, when Turkish forces attempted to relieve the besieged city, Bohemond deliberately positioned reserves to counterattack pursuing enemies, exactly the tactic that had destroyed the Varangians. At the Battle of Dyrrhachium earlier in the Crusade, Bohemond's division was nearly overwhelmed by Turkish horse archers, but he maintained discipline and waited for reinforcements rather than pursuing scattered enemies, demonstrating that he had internalized the lessons of Dyrrhachium. The battle also highlighted the limitations of mercenary armies. Alexios had assembled his force through a combination of professional troops, allied contingents, and hired mercenaries. When the battle turned against him, allied forces like Constantine Bodan's Serbians simply left. They had no compelling reason to die for Byzantine interests. The Turkish auxiliaries similarly withdrew when victory seemed unlikely. Mercenaries fought for pay, not patriotism, and would not sacrifice themselves in hopeless situations. Only the imperial troops, the Varangians, and a few loyal units stayed and fought. This reality influenced Byzantine military policy for decades afterward. Alexios increasingly relied on granting land to soldiers in exchange for military service, creating a system similar to Western feudalism, where loyalty was secured through economic interest rather than cash payments. The pronoia system, as it was called, emerged partly from the lessons of Dyrrhachium about the unreliability of purely mercenary forces. The Norman victory at Dyrrhachium also had diplomatic repercussions across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, which had been fighting the Normans in Italy, now viewed them with increased wariness. If Norman forces could defeat the Byzantine Empire in open battle, they were a genuine threat to imperial interests. Pope Gregory VII, who had been trying to use the Normans as a counterweight against German imperial power, found his allies becoming increasingly independent and powerful. The Normans' success in defeating Byzantium gave them leverage in negotiations with the papacy. Venice, which had provided crucial naval support to Alexios, emerged as the primary beneficiary of the battle's aftermath. In exchange for their help, they received extensive trading privileges in the Byzantine Empire that laid the foundation for Venetian commercial dominance in the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The technical aspects of the battle became subjects of intense study among military professionals. How had the Norman cavalry broken the Varangian line? The answer lay in combined arms warfare. The crossbowmen had softened the Varangian formation with long-range fire, the spearmen had engaged them in close combat to fix them in place, and the cavalry had delivered the killing blow from the flank and rear. No single arm could have destroyed the Varangians, but the coordinated action of all three proved overwhelming. This lesson reinforced the trend toward combined arms tactics that characterized later medieval warfare. Successful armies needed cavalry, infantry, and missile troops working together, not simply masses of one type of soldier. The Varangian axes themselves became objects of fascination and fear. Norman soldiers who had fought at Dyrrhachium brought back accounts of seeing these weapons cleave through armour, split shields, and decapitate horses with single blows. Some claimed to have acquired Varangian axes as trophies, though most of these were probably burned in the church along with their owners. The psychological impact of facing such weapons influenced armour development in subsequent decades. Knights began wearing heavier protection, particularly on shoulders and necks where axe blows would naturally fall. The great helm, which enclosed the entire head in steel, became more common partly as a response to weapons like the Danish axe that could split open earlier open-faced helmets. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Robert Guiscard faced the practical problem of what to do with his victory. He had destroyed the Byzantine field army, but Dyrrhachium still held out. The city's garrison, though shocked by the battle's outcome, continued resisting behind strong walls. Guiscard resumed the siege with renewed vigour, knowing that relief was now impossible. He deployed his full arsenal of siege weaponry. Mangonels hurled stones against the walls, attempting to breach the fortifications. Siege towers were constructed and pushed forward, allowing attackers to reach the height of the walls. Mining operations began, with tunnels dug under the walls to collapse sections of fortification. The defenders fought back with everything available. They poured boiling oil on attackers climbing siege ladders. They used catapults to destroy Norman siege engines. They conducted night raids to burn siege works. George Palaiologos proved to be an inspired defensive commander, maintaining morale despite hopeless strategic circumstances. The siege dragged on through winter into early 1082. Conditions inside Dyrrhachium deteriorated as food supplies dwindled and disease spread through the crowded city. The defenders were slowly starving, but they refused to surrender. The memory of what happened to the Varangians encouraged resistance. If the Normans would burn prisoners alive in a church, what mercy would they show to a surrendered garrison? By February 1082, the situation inside the city was desperate. Then the Italian residents, merchants who had been living in Dyrrhachium for years conducting trade, made a secret arrangement with the Normans. Exactly what they were promised remains unclear, probably protection for their property and persons. On the night of February 21, 1082, these merchants opened gates from inside. Norman troops poured into the city before the garrison could react. Street fighting erupted throughout Dyrrhachium as Byzantine soldiers tried to contain the breach. George Palaiologos fought to the end. He rallied troops around the citadel and attempted to organize a final defensive stand, but the situation was hopeless. Norman forces controlled most of the city, and more poured through the opened gates every minute. Palaiologos was captured, though sources differ on whether he surrendered when further resistance became impossible, or was taken wounded after his final position was overrun. Guiscard treated him with respect, recognizing a worthy opponent. The garrison survivors were allowed to surrender with their lives, a stark contrast to the fate of the Varangians. Perhaps Guiscard had learned that burning prisoners created more resistance than it suppressed, or perhaps he simply distinguished between soldiers who fought in formation during battle and those who defended a city under siege. The fall of Dyrrhachium opened the Balkans to Norman conquest. With no Byzantine field army capable of opposition and the major fortress city captured, resistance collapsed across the region. Cities throughout Epirus and Macedonia surrendered, without fighting. Norman garrisons were installed, oaths of loyalty extracted from local nobles and taxes imposed. For a brief moment in 1082, it appeared that Robert Guiscard might actually carve out a Norman kingdom in the Balkans to match his domains in southern Italy. He controlled a strip of territory along the Adriatic coast and was pushing inland toward Thessalonica, the second city of the Byzantine Empire. If Thessalonica fell, Constantinople itself might be threatened. But Guiscard's ambitions exceeded his resources. Holding conquered territory required garrisons, administrators, and continuous military presence to suppress rebellion. The Norman army, while excellent in battle, was too small to occupy and control the vast territories they had overrun. Local populations remained hostile, loyal to the Byzantine Empire by culture, religion, and centuries of tradition. They paid taxes to Norman authorities but sabotaged supply convoys, provided intelligence to Byzantine forces still operating in the mountains, and waited for opportunities to rebel. Alexios, operating from Constantinople, recognized that he could not defeat the Normans in open battle, but could make occupation unsustainable through asymmetric warfare. He sent gold to local leaders encouraging resistance. He dispatched small units to harass Norman supply lines. He negotiated with Venice to maintain naval pressure. Most effectively, he used diplomacy to create problems for Guiscard in Italy. The Pope, Gregory VII, was besieged in Rome by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. This was part of the larger investiture controversy, the struggle between papal and imperial authority over appointing bishops and other church offices. Gregory had excommunicated Henry, and Henry had responded by declaring Gregory deposed and marching on Rome with an army. Gregory desperately needed help, and his most powerful military ally was Robert Guiscard. The Norman duke was technically the Pope's vassal, having received papal approval for his conquests in southern Italy in exchange for acknowledging papal overlordship. When Gregory called for aid, Guiscard faced an impossible choice. He could continue his Balkan campaign and potentially conquer significant Byzantine territory, but at the cost of allowing his nominal overlord to be captured or killed, or he could abandon his conquests, return to Italy, and lose everything he had gained. Alexios's agents made sure Guiscard understood that rebellion was already brewing in Norman-controlled southern Italy during his absence. If he stayed in the Balkans, he might lose Italy. In spring 1083, Guiscard made his decision. He would return to Italy with most of his army, leaving Bohemond with a reduced force to hold the Balkan conquests. This proved to be a strategic mistake. Bohemond, though a capable commander, did not have sufficient troops to garrison cities, suppress resistance, and fight Byzantine forces simultaneously. The decision split. Norman strengthened allowed Alexios to engage in exactly the kind of war he could win, gradual attrition against an overstretched opponent. Guiscard sailed back to Italy with his best troops and proceeded to rescue Pope Gregory from Rome. His army fought its way into the city, drove out the imperial forces and freed the Pope from siege. However, Norman troops then sacked Rome so thoroughly, burning neighbourhoods and looting churches, that Gregory became almost as unpopular with Romans as his enemies. The Pope was forced to flee to Salerno under Norman protection, where he died in 1085, reportedly saying, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity. Therefore I die in exile." Meanwhile, in the Balkans, Bohemond won several impressive tactical victories but could not hold territory. At Ioannina, he outmaneuvered a Byzantine army and captured the city through a combination of assault and negotiation. At Larissa, he defeated another Byzantine force in open battle, again demonstrating Norman cavalry effectiveness. But each victory simply pushed Byzantine forces back temporarily, without destroying their capability to resist. Alexios refused to commit to decisive battle. He had learned at Dyrrhachium that the Normans excelled in set-piece engagements. Instead, he harassed, delayed, and avoided, waiting for the Normans to overextend themselves. Byzantine forces would appear, threaten a Norman garrison, then fade away when Norman cavalry came to engage. Supply convoys were ambushed, foraging parties disappeared. Norman-held cities faced constant pressure from Byzantine forces operating from nearby mountains. By 1084, Bohemond's position was deteriorating. His father was occupied in Italy, Reinforcements were not arriving, local populations were increasingly hostile. Byzantine military pressure was intensifying. Then Venice re-entered the war with full force. The Venetian fleet, having recovered from earlier losses, attacked Norman-held ports along the Albanian coast. They captured Dyrrhachium in a surprise assault in 1084, opening the gates and allowing Byzantine troops to retake the city. The Normans had held it for less than 2 years. With Dyrrhachium back in Byzantine hands, the entire Norman position in the Balkans became untenable. Supply lines were cut. Coastal cities could be attacked from the sea. Bohemond fought a series of rearguard actions as he withdrew westward, trying to hold key fortresses while evacuating Norman colonists and administrators. Robert Guiscard, learning of his son's difficulties, prepared another expedition. In fall 1084, he assembled a fleet and army and sailed back across the Adriatic to reinforce Bohemond. The Norman duke was now nearly 70 years old, extraordinarily old for medieval times, but he remained vigorous and determined. He captured Corfu again, re-establishing a forward base. He defeated a Venetian fleet in a naval battle, demonstrating that Norman naval capabilities had improved. He landed on the mainland and began planning a new offensive to recapture lost territory. But disease, probably typhoid fever or dysentery, swept through his army during winter camp. Medieval armies suffered terribly from epidemic disease when concentrated in one location for extended periods. Poor sanitation, contaminated water supplies, and crowded conditions created perfect environments for disease to spread. The Norman army was devastated. Thousands died, including many experienced soldiers who had fought at Dyrrhachium and subsequent battles. On July 17, 1085, Robert Guiscard himself succumbed to fever on the island of Kefalonia. The man who had conquered southern Italy, defeated Byzantine armies, humbled popes, and carved out one of the most impressive careers in medieval history died in a tent on a Greek island, his grand ambitions unfulfilled. His body was returned to Italy for burial, but his Balkan campaign died with him. Bohemond withdrew entirely from Byzantine territory by the end of 1085, taking his remaining forces back to Italy. The Norman invasion, which had seemed poised to conquer the Byzantine Balkans after Dyrrhachium, ended in complete strategic failure. Alexios had won through patience, diplomacy, and strategic exhaustion what he could not win through battle. The Varangians who died at Dyrrhachium never knew that their sacrifice, while tactically disastrous, was part of an ultimately successful Byzantine strategic resistance. The Battle of Dyrrhachium was a crushing defeat, but it was not decisive. The war continued for 4 more years, and the Byzantine Empire survived. The lesson was that tactical victories, even overwhelming ones, do not automatically translate to strategic success. Guiscard had defeated the Byzantine army, captured their major fortress, and overrun their Balkan provinces, yet 5 years later the Byzantines had recovered everything. The Varangian Guard was reconstituted in the years after Dyrrhachium, though its character changed. The recruitment pool shifted back towards Scandinavians, particularly Norse and Danes, with fewer English warriors. The catastrophic losses at Dyrrhachium had depleted the English diaspora in Byzantine service. Moreover, as years passed after the Norman conquest, fewer young English warriors were willing to travel to Constantinople. Those born after 1066 grew up under Norman rule, and knew England only as a Norman kingdom. The burning hatred that motivated the Varangians at Dyrrhachium faded with time and generational change. The reconstituted Guard served with distinction in Alexios's later campaigns. They fought against Pechenegs, Seljuk Turks, and various Balkan peoples. They maintained their traditional role as imperial bodyguards, but they never again achieved the fearsome reputation of the pre-Dyrrhachium Guard. Their moment as one of the most elite military units in the world had passed, burned away in that Albanian church in October 1081. The legacy of the Battle of Dyrrhachium extended far beyond its immediate participants. It demonstrated conclusively that Norman heavy cavalry, properly used in combined arms operations with supporting infantry and missile troops, could defeat virtually any opponent in set-piece battle. This encouraged Norman military adventurism across Europe and the Mediterranean. When the First Crusade was called in 1095, Norman nobles like Bohemond were among the first to take up the cross, confident that their military system could defeat any enemy they encountered. The Crusader states established in Syria and Palestine were heavily influenced by Norman military organisation. The Principality of Antioch, ruled by Bohemond, was essentially a Norman kingdom transplanted to the Levant. Its military system, fortifications, and tactical doctrines all reflected lessons learned in battles like Dyrrhachium. The emphasis on heavy cavalry supported by castles and fortified positions became standard crusader practice. For Byzantium, Dyrrhachium reinforced the empire's turn toward a more defensive strategic posture. Alexios and his successors built extensively on lessons learned from the battle. They fortified cities more heavily, making sieges longer and more difficult. They emphasized diplomacy and alliances over military confrontation when possible. They developed military tactics specifically designed to avoid the kind of set-piece battles where Norman cavalry excelled. The Byzantine army became more flexible, mobile, and focused on skirmishing rather than close combat. These changes allowed the empire to survive for another 3.5 centuries despite being surrounded by enemies and plagued by internal problems. The memory of the Varangians burning in the church became a powerful symbol in Byzantine culture. Religious writers used it as an example of martyrdom, warriors who died rather than surrender to heretics. Never mind that the Normans were Catholics rather than pagans or Muslims. Secular historians used it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of indiscipline and pursuit. Military manuals referenced Dyrrhachium when discussing the importance of maintaining formation and coordination. The battle entered Byzantine historical consciousness as one of those pivotal disasters that shaped the empire's trajectory. In Norman territories, the battle was celebrated in song and story. Troubadours composed chansons about Robert Guiscard's victory over the fearsome axe-bearers from the north. The burning church became an image of Norman triumph, proof that Norman arms could not be resisted. Chronicles written for Norman patrons described the battle in glowing terms, often exaggerating the size of the Byzantine army and the completeness of the Norman victory to make the achievement seem even more impressive. In England, by contrast, the battle was forgotten or ignored. Anglo-Saxon culture was being systematically suppressed by Norman authorities. The English language was reduced to the speech of peasants, while Norman, French became the language of court, church, and administration. English historical writing declined dramatically after the conquest. The few English intellectuals still writing focused on local matters or religious subjects, not military events in distant Albania. The fate of the English Varangians at Dyrrhachium disappeared from English historical memory, remembered only in Byzantine and Norman sources. Modern historians rediscovered the battle in the 19th century, when Byzantine sources became more widely available in Western Europe. The Alexiad, Anna Komnena's history, was translated into various languages and revealed the details of Dyrrhachium to a new audience. Scholars recognized the battle's significance as both a tactical disaster and a strategic turning point. Academic debates emerged about various aspects of the battle, with particularly intense discussion about exactly why the Varangians pursued so recklessly and whether their commander lost control or ordered the pursuit. Military historians have studied Dyrrhachium as a classic example of combined arms warfare and the importance of reserves. The battle is sometimes used in military academies as a case study in how tactical victories can be overturned through proper use of counterattacks. The contrast between the Varangians' initial success in holding against cavalry and their subsequent annihilation when they broke formation illustrates fundamental principles of infantry tactics. Recent archaeological work in Albania has attempted to locate the actual battlefield, though precise locations remain uncertain. The Church of the Archangel Michael, where the Varangians burned, has never been definitively identified. It may have been destroyed in subsequent conflicts, or it might still exist incorporated into later buildings. Albanian historians and archaeologists continue searching for physical evidence of the battle, including mass graves that might contain the remains of fallen Varangians. Such discoveries would provide important information about medieval military equipment, casualty rates, and battlefield conditions. The Battle of Dyrrhachium represents intersection of multiple historical currents. The Norman expansion across Europe and the Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire struggled to survive against multiple enemies, the diaspora of English warriors after the Norman conquest, the development of medieval military tactics, and the complex diplomatic networks of the 11th century Mediterranean world all converged on the Albanian battlefield in October 1081. For a few hours, these forces clashed in brutal combat that killed thousands and changed the course of empires. The Varangians, who stood in the Byzantine line that morning, could not have known they were participating in such a historically significant event. They knew only that they faced Normans, their people's conquerors, and they had a chance for revenge. When Norman cavalry charged them, they held firm, displaying the courage and skill that had made the Varangian Guard legendary. When those same enemies fled, the Varangians pursued, driven by hatred and the intoxication of victory. And when Norman forces surrounded them and burned them alive, they died as warriors far from home, their sacrifice remembered by historians but forgotten by the English people they had sought to avenge. The thunder of hooves, the clash of weapons, the screams of dying men, and the roar of flames consuming a church filled with trapped warriors. These were the sounds of Dyrrhachium. When silence finally fell over the battlefield at day's end, the Varangian Guard lay dead, the Byzantine army was scattered in defeat, and Norman victory seemed complete. But wars are not decided in single battles, and the Byzantines would ultimately prevail strategically despite losing tactically. The Varangians died for nothing in the immediate sense. Their sacrifice did not save the Byzantine army, did not prevent the fall of Dyrrhachium, and did not stop the Norman invasion. Yet in the larger arc of the war, their resistance, combined with that of other Byzantine forces and Venice's naval power, contributed to wearing down Norman strength until even Robert Guiscard's tactical brilliance could not sustain his conquests. When Norman knights charged the Varangian Guard at Dyrrhachium, they were driven back in terror by warriors who refused to break. When those same warriors broke formation and charged in pursuit, they were surrounded and destroyed in minutes, burned alive as their enemies watched. The transformation from triumph to annihilation, from tactical success to catastrophic defeat, took less than an hour. That terrible reversal, born of indiscipline and hatred, destroyed one of the medieval world's most elite military units, and ensured that the English warriors who died there would be remembered not for their courage or skill, but for their fatal mistake. The ashes of the Church of the Archangel Michael, if they could speak, would tell a story of how quickly fortune turns in war, how vengeance can blind warriors to tactical reality, and how even the mightiest fighters can be destroyed when they forget the basic principles that keep soldiers alive. The Varangians learned that lesson too late, and they paid for it with their lives in fire and smoke on an Albanian battlefield 1,000 years ago.